The day had started like any other in the bustling city of Lagos. The streets were alive with the sounds of car horns blaring, vendors loudly advertising their goods, and the chatter of children playing nearby. Yet, within the four walls of Ugochi's modest apartment, time seemed to stand still. The normally vibrant young woman now sat in a daze on her neatly made bed, clutching a small white stick that had changed her world in an instant. The two bold lines on the pregnancy test stared back at her, confirming her deepest fear. She was pregnant. But this was not ordinary pregnancy. A wave of panic washed over Ugochi as she realized the gravity of her situation. She had been with 7 different men over the past few months, and now she was left to face the consequences. The fear of the unknown gripped her heart, her mind racing as she tried to process the implications of this life-altering revelation. Ugochi's thoughts spiraled as she began to trace the tangled web of her recent relationships. Each man had walked into her life during a moment of vulnerability, filling different voids. David, the handsome and confident businessman, had swept her off her feet with his ambition and charm nature. Michael, the doctor, had shown her a side of compassion and care that made her feel safe. Femi, with his carefree spirit and musical talent, had introduced her to a world of creativity and freedom. James, the teacher, had brought humor and lightness into her life, while Emeka, the politician, had captivated her with his ambition and power. Collins, the gentle artist, had provided her with a sense of peace and understanding, and Namdi, her loyal friend, had always been there, offering stability in her chaotic world. Each relationship had been significant in its own way, but now they all seemed to blend together into a blur of confusion. Ugochi had kept her connections with these men separate, never allowing any of them to fully overlap. But now her secret was on the verge of unraveling, and she had no idea how to navigate the storm that was about to hit. The walls of Ugochi's apartment felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her under the weight of her secret. She needed to talk to someone she could trust, someone who would understand without judgment. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone and called Amaka, her best friend since childhood. Amaka's voice, filled with concern, was a comforting balm to Ugochi's worried spirit. "Ugochi, what's wrong? You sound so upset," Amaka asked as soon as she heard the tremble in Ugochi's voice. Within minutes, Amaka was at Ugochi's door, her face etched with worry. As soon as she stepped inside, Ugochi broke down in tears, the reality of her situation spilling out in choked sobs. "Amaka, I'm pregnant," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "And I don't know who the father is because there are 7 men." Amaka's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly pulled Ugochi into a tight embrace, holding her as she cried. "We'll get through this together, Ugochi," Amaka whispered soothingly. "But you need to start by being honest with these men. They deserve to know the truth." Gathering her courage, Ugochi decided to start with David. He was the one she had always imagined might become something more serious, and she owed him the truth. She chose a quiet cafe in Victoria Island, a place they had often visited during their dates. As they sat down, Ugochi could feel her heart pounding in her chest. David's eyes were filled with warmth and affection, completely unaware of the bombshell she was about to drop. "David, I have something important to tell you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She saw the flash of concern in his eyes as he leaned in closer, urging her to continue. "I'm pregnant," she said, watching as a smile of joy spread across his face. But before he could speak, she added, "But I'm not sure if you're the father. I've been with other men." The change in David's expression was immediate, his joy replaced by shock, then hurt. He pulled back, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "How could you do this, Ugochi?" "I trusted you," he said, his voice trembling. The guilt washed over her as she realized just how much pain she had caused him, and she knew this was only the beginning of a series of difficult conversations. Next on her list was Michael, the doctor who had always been so kind and attentive. Ugochi invited him over to her apartment, knowing this conversation would be just as difficult as the last. As he arrived, she could see the concern in his eyes, his intuition already picking up on her distress. They sat down in the living room, and Ugochi took a deep breath, forcing herself to look him in the eye. "Michael, I'm pregnant," she began, her voice steady but filled with apprehension. Michael's face softened with a smile, but before he could respond, she added, "I don't know if you're the father. I've been with other men." His smile faded, replaced by a look of deep hurt. He stood up abruptly, walking over to the window, his back to her as he stared out at the bustling city below. "Agochi, I love you," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "But this is too much. How can I be with you, knowing you've been with others?" Agochi felt her heart break a little more as she watched him struggle with the revelation. She knew she couldn't expect him to stay, and as he left, the reality of her situation began to sink in, even deeper. Femi, the talented musician with a carefree attitude, was next. Agochi met him at a small music studio where he was recording a new track. She waited for him to finish, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. When he finally joined her, he was all smiles, his easygoing nature putting her slightly at ease. But that comfort was short-lived as she began to speak. "Femi, I have something serious to tell you," she started, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm pregnant, but I don't know if you're the father because, well, I've been with other men." There was a long silence as Femi absorbed her words. Then, to her surprise, he let out a bitter laugh. "This is quite a mess, isn't it?" he said, shaking his head. "But I guess we have to figure this out." His reaction was so unexpected that Agochi felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Femi wasn't angry, but the reality of the situation still weighed heavily on her. They talked for a while longer, and although Femi's attitude was more accepting than the others, it didn't make her predicament any easier to bear. Agochi dreaded her next meeting, but she knew she couldn't avoid it. James, the funny and light-hearted teacher, had always made her laugh, and she was unsure how he would react to her news. She met him at the school where he worked, choosing the privacy of an empty classroom for their conversation. "James, there's something I need to tell you," she said quickly. "I'm pregnant, but I don't know who the father is because I've been with other men." She braced herself for his reaction, but to her surprise, James' eyes widened in shock before he burst into laughter. "Agochi, you really know how to make things complicated, don't you?" he said, still chuckling. His laughter faded as he saw the seriousness in her expression. "But we need to solve this," he added, his tone becoming more serious. Despite the gravity of the situation, James' reaction brought a small smile to Agochi's face. His ability to find humor in the darkest moments was something she had always admired, but she knew this was no laughing matter. The encounter Agochi dreaded the most was with Emeka, the ambitious politician whose reputation was everything to him. She knew that her news would be a huge blow to his pride and could potentially damage his career. They met at his office. Agochi's hands shook as she sat across from him, trying to find the right words. "Emeka, I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling. His face initially lit up with pride, but she quickly added, "But I don't know if you're the father. I've been with other men." The change in Emeka's face was instant. His face flushed with anger, and he slammed his hand on the desk. "Agochi, how could you do this to me?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the room. "Do you have any idea what this could do to my career?" Agochi tried to explain, but Emeka was beyond listening. He stormed out of the office, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Namdi had always been a pillar of strength for Agochi, someone she could turn to when life felt overwhelming. He was the kind of friend who would drop everything to be by her side, and Agochi knew that telling him about her situation would be the hardest part. She dreaded the moment, fearing that she might lose the one person who had never judged her. When she finally mustered the courage to speak with him, they met at their usual spot at the cafe that had witnessed many of their heartfelt conversations over the years. As Agochi began to explain, her voice trembling with fear and shame, she couldn't bring herself to look Namdi in the eye. But as she spoke, she felt his unwavering gaze upon her, filled not with judgment, but with deep concern and care. When she finished, there was a long silence. Agochi's heart pounded in her chest, and she could barely breathe. Then, Namdi gently took her hand in his and said, "Agochi, you know I care about you. We'll find a way to deal with this. You're not alone." His words were like a balm to her wounded soul, bringing a sense of peace to her troubled heart. For the first time in days, Agochi allowed herself to breathe, to hope. She realized that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she wouldn't have to walk it alone. With Namdi by her side, she felt a little stronger, a little more ready to face whatever came next. After much contemplation and sleepless nights, she made a difficult decision. She would bring all 7 men together to discuss what had happened. Inviting them to a private meeting was nerve-wracking. Ogochi knew it wouldn't be easy. The emotions were high, and the situation was complex. When the day finally came, she found herself pacing nervously in the small, dimly lit room where they were to meet. As the men began to arrive, she could feel the tension in the air thickening. Each one of them entered the room with different expressions: confusion, anger, and anxiety. Ogochi stood at the center of the room, her hands shaking slightly as she gathered the courage to speak. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice quivering with fear and uncertainty. The room fell silent as they all focused on her. "I know this is difficult, but we need to find a solution together." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Ogochi's heart was pounding so loudly that she wondered if the others could hear it. She could sense the unease in the room, the uncertainty of what was to come. But despite the fear, she knew this was a step she had to take, not just for herself, but for the future she was about to face. As soon as Ogochi finished speaking, the room erupted into a chaotic storm of emotions. The men were understandably upset, and their anger quickly spilled over into the conversation. David, the one who had always been the most outspoken, was the first to voice his frustration. "How do we know who's the father?" he demanded, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. Femi, sitting across from David, nodded in agreement, his eyes flashing with anger. "Are we just supposed to guess?" he added, his tone sharp and accusatory. The others joined in, their voices blending into a cacophony of accusations and demands. It was as if all the pent-up emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted, and Ogochi found herself at the center of it all, feeling utterly overwhelmed. She tried to calm the situation, but her voice was drowned out by the growing tension in the room. The men were too caught up in their own feelings to listen, and Ogochi feared that the conversation was spiraling out of control. She had expected resistance, but the intensity of their emotions was more than she had anticipated. Just when it seemed like the situation might escalate further, Amaka, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room, stepped in. "Enough," she said, her voice firm and authoritative. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Amaka's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the heated emotions swirling around them, and it had an immediate effect on everyone in the room. Ogochi felt a surge of gratitude towards her friend, who had always been the voice of reason in chaotic situations. With the room finally quiet, Amaka took a deep breath and addressed the group. "We need to take a paternity test," she suggested, her voice calm and steady. "It's the only way to know for sure who the father is." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of reason and practicality. The men, who had been so caught up in their emotions moments earlier, now seemed to be processing what Amaka had said. Slowly, the reality of the situation began to sink in, and they realized that there was no other way forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. There was a moment of silence as they all considered the suggestion. Then, one by one, the men began to nod in agreement. Ogochi felt a small sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't a solution yet, but it was a start, a way to begin untangling the complex web they had found themselves in. The tension in the room began to dissipate as they discussed the logistics of taking the test. There were still undercurrents of anger and resentment, but there was also a sense of reluctant acceptance. They all knew that this was the only way to move forward. Ogochi, though still anxious about the uncertainty that lay ahead, felt a flicker of hope. She was not alone in this, and together, they would face whatever came next. The days leading up to the paternity test results were some of the longest and most agonizing of Ogochi's life. Every day felt like a year, and every hour dragged on endlessly. She tried to keep herself busy, diving into her work and daily routines, but no matter what she did, the anxiety was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. At night, sleep eluded her. She would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with endless possibilities. What would the results reveal? How would the men react? What would happen to her future? These questions and more tormented her day and night. The uncertainty was like a heavy weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to function. The men were also struggling with the waiting. Each of them dealt with the stress in their own way. Some threw themselves into their work, while others sought distraction in social activities. But no matter how hard they tried to carry on with their lives, the impending test results were never far from their thoughts. For Agochi, the waiting was the hardest part. It felt as if her entire life was on hold. Every time her phone rang, her heart would leap into her throat, only to be disappointed when it wasn't the call she had been waiting for. She felt trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and anticipation, with no way out but to wait for the truth to finally come to light. The day of the test results arrived with a sense of finality. Agochi could barely eat or sleep the night before, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. As she made her way to the clinic, she felt a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The others were already there when she arrived, each of them looking just as anxious as she felt. They sat in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, the doctor entered the room, holding an envelope that seemed to contain the entire future of their lives. He looked around the room, his expression serious as he spoke. "The results are conclusive," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "The father is..." He paused, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. "David." The word hung in the air, echoing in Agochi's mind. David's face was a mix of relief and shock as he processed the news. The other men sat in stunned silence, each of them grappling with their own emotions. Agochi felt a whirlwind of emotions herself. Relief that the uncertainty was over, shock at the revelation, and a strange sense of calm that settled over her like a warm blanket. David turned to look at Agochi, his expression softening as their eyes met. In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. It wasn't the outcome any of them had expected, but it was the reality they would have to face. Agochi felt a surge of emotion welling up inside her. Fear, hope, and a deep sense of relief. Whatever happened next, at least they knew the truth.